Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us to the second in what is a set of virtual panel discussions around the banner kind of provocation really of can mining make the world a greener place? I should introduce myself. I'm Ian Stewart. I'm your moderator for this session. I'm Professor of Geoscience Communication at the University of Plymouth in the UK. We've had other sessions. We've had a previous session that you might have been involved in where we find metals, but no worries if you weren't involved in that. We're starting afresh with this one, but just to say there's two other sessions that's coming along, the one on the future shape of mining and one on prospects for a circular economy. But this particular panel, as you can see, has got the theme of can mining be safe and sustainable? And to take us through that interesting, timely topic, we've got a stellar lineup really of people. We're going to have a keynote address really from Thomas Maddox, who I'll introduce more in just a second. But if I can introduce the other panelists that will join us later, you can see there we've got Doris Hiam-Galvez. And Doris is the director, is a metallurgist. She is the director of metals at Hatch, which is a mining and metallurgy consultancy company. She ran Hatch Europe until March 2017. And then before that, she was CTO of Novelis, which is a global aluminium manufacturing company. Something we'll hear, I'm sure, from Doris is that she developed this designing sustainable prosperity concept, which goes beyond just investing in mining operations to developing local economies. And so looking at that as a regional driver. We then have Adrian Glover. Adrian is a senior researcher in biodiversity, is part of the life sciences department at the Natural History Museum, is one of our hosts today. He runs a research lab looking at baseline patterns of biodiversity, biogeography, and genetic connectivity in the connection with deep sea mining. We then have Peter Harvey, and Peter is Managing Director and responsibility for closing and legacy management at Rio Tinto. He's worked in a number of roles at Rio Tinto, worked in exploration and different projects, energy and minerals. But importantly, I think one of the things is he's got a master's in occupational psychology, which is not necessarily what you expect all the time from mining related folks, but with an interest in entrepreneurial and consulting, and really this idea of legacy and the life cycle of mines will be pretty important. We then will have finally, last but not least, is Andy Clifton. Andy is a global sustainability manager at Rolls-Royce. He started at Rolls-Royce Defence Aerospace, but over the last 9 years, he's got the post of manager for sustainable development. And in that role, he's responsible for integrating the consideration for environment and sustainability into all aspects of engineering and design. And this session, then, we're going to take through, I guess the watchword of this session is responsibility. The notion that governments around the world really have signed up to pledges around zero carbon future, the energy transition, sustainable development goals. And as we heard in the previous session, part of that will require a step change increase in the amount of mining. And how are we going to do that? What's it going to look like? How are we going to get there? That responsibility is going to come in different guises: economic and corporate social responsibility, social community, and environmental and ecological. And really, we'll be delving into all of that. But to get us kicked off, I'm going to invite in Thomas Maddox. Thomas is Senior Technical Advisor at Fauna and Flora International. He's worked at the interface between business and environment for nearly 2 decades now, and worked for things like organisations like Zoological Society of London, World Bank, University of Cambridge, WWF. And really, this balancing act between kind of nature and mining is his territory. And really, he's going to kick us off with a title that says, "Can mining coexist with nature?" So Thomas, can you take us up, get us going?
Great. Can I just check you can hear me loud and clear?
I can hear you fine, thank you.
Excellent. So in my job at Fauna and Flora International, we try and work with companies to help them transition to being fit for purpose for a future low carbon, sustainable and equitable economy. In particular, we focus on the extractive sector, a sector you could argue is inherently unsustainable because it's based on removing non-renewable resources from a finite source. But the way we respond to these challenges varies according to what's being extracted. For companies extracting fossil fuels, the options are stark. Few people can envisage any significant role for fossil fuels in a future low-carbon economy, particularly as alternatives become increasingly attractive. For that reason, the response to fossil fuel companies tends to focus on the transition away from the core product, as opposed to focusing on greening fossil fuel production or finding ways to coexist with nature. But mining for other minerals presents a different challenge. Who can imagine a future economy without steel, without copper, without aluminium? Does anybody really want such a future? Indeed, the products of mining are not only fundamental components of our existing economy, they're also required for many of the technologies we require for a future low carbon economy. Solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, lightweight vehicles, all of them rely on mined materials. Now, of course, there are important discussions to be held on where renewable alternatives might play a role. There are even more important discussions to be had about replacing mining with recycling. But unfortunately for most minerals, we're still a long way from that point, both in terms of the volumes of minerals required and in terms of the recycling technology available. So unlike fossil fuel extraction, mining for minerals is set to be a major component of our economy for the foreseeable future. So the question I was asked to consider in this open presentation was, can mining and nature coexist? Now, the answer right now is probably rarely, but I would argue this is probably the wrong question to be focusing on. Mining has to coexist with nature. Our future depends on it. Our challenge is to work out how. So over the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to take you on a very quick tour. Firstly, of what we understand about our impacts of mining on nature. Secondly, on how these impacts are being responded to at the moment. And thirdly, with some suggestions for discussion on how they might be responded to better tomorrow. I do focus on terrestrial mining, particularly mining in forests, which is the area that I specialize in, but hopefully many of the concepts are applicable to other forms of mining too. So what are the impacts of mining on nature? Anyone that stood on the edge of a mine and viewed the moonscape stretched out below them or read the stories in the media about tailings collapses or pollutant spillovers knows that mining can impact nature. But these impacts come in various forms. That picture of an open cast mine I just described, that refers to some of the direct impacts of mining associated with the establishment of a mine. So the mine footprint is one of the most visible of these. The footprint refers not only to the hole in the ground, but also to the waste deposit sites, the processing plants, and various associated infrastructure. Now, these footprints can be as small as a few hundred square meters for some small-scale mines, but in general, to be economically viable, mining has to be done on a vast scale. So mines focusing on lower value, high volume ores like iron sometimes measure several thousand square kilometers in size. Another direct impact occurs as the mine operates. One of the byproducts of mining and ore processing can be various forms of pollution, mercury, arsenic, sulfuric acid, for example. Pollution is generally regulated and managed, but almost every mine will cause some level of pollution to the environment. Often the levels of pollution that are allowed can be significant. So over the 16 years of operation of the Mar Copper mine in the Philippines, for example, there's an estimated 200 million tons of waste were released into shallow coastal waters, causing widespread lead pollution and extensive environmental and social impacts. Pollution is not only into the waterways. Increasingly, greenhouse gas emissions are becoming one of the primary pollutants to be recognized. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions from non-coal mining operations are estimated to account for about 1% of global emissions. But if coal mining is included, then the mining sector contributes more like 4 to 7%. And then such impacts are exacerbated, of course, many times over if things go wrong. The last high-profile incident was the collapse of the Samarco dam tailings in Brazil about 5 years ago. And in that accident, 43 million cubic meters of tailings were accidentally released, killing 19 people immediately and polluting nearly 700 kilometers of river courses. So these are all direct impacts of mining. They're highly visible and they're relatively well understood. Far less visible, less well understood are the indirect and the cumulative impacts of mining. An example of an indirect impact is the influx of people drawn to a mining project. The mining projects in developing countries, in particular, can have a huge economic impact at a local level, and that can result in hundreds of thousands of people moving to the area, either to work in the mine or to serve those that do. So at the Freeport Grasberg mine in Papua, nearly 2 million people have moved to the area since the project started, and that doubles the local population. Those kind of changes can drive enormous social upheaval, but they can also cause vast environmental upheaval, as incoming people clear land for new agriculture, remove trees for timber, and firewood, and hunt local wildlife for food or trade. The influx of people is also associated with another indirect impact. That's the impact of the infrastructure associated with the mining. So this is the roads and railways built to transport the mining gear in and the mining products out. This infrastructure then facilitates people moving into areas that are sparsely populated, which in turn exacerbates the same pressures on land clearing and timber removal that I mentioned a second ago. And this is a phenomenon dubbed the Pandora's box effect. In some parts of the world, major infrastructure projects are now recognized as the biggest threat to nature. Indirect impacts can also apply to pollution. So earlier I said mining is thought to account for up to 7% of greenhouse gas emissions, but if you include indirect emissions, that's scope 3 emissions, mining could account for close to 30% of global emissions. Finally, cumulative impacts are important. So cumulative impacts are when multiple smaller impacts occur in the same area. So given mining is an industry that naturally clusters around mineral ores, the existence of multiple projects in a given landscape is common. But management of those impacts is generally focused at a project level. Now, each of those projects might have an impact that's considered in isolation to be acceptable, but unless there's a coordinated approach to measurement and management, then those cumulative impacts can be unpredicted, unmanaged, and much more harmful as a result. But let's put this in context. Appearances can be deceptive. Whilst mining's got one of the most visible impacts on the environment, visibility doesn't always equate with scale. So the biggest driver of deforestation in developing countries, for example, is not mining, it's agriculture. Agriculture accounts for about 70% of forest loss. Mining is thought to account for about 7%, 10 times less. Infrastructure, some of which will be associated with mining, accounts for another 9%. Similarly, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, according to IPBES, is thought to be land use change to agriculture. Mining is barely in the top 10 of sectors impacting endangered species, according to one analysis. There are caveats to this, of course. First of all, the impacts of mining are on the increase in many parts of the world. In our study on forest mining, we showed that there are over 1,500 large-scale mines in forests today, and that potentially impacts about 10% of all forests. But this number has been growing exponentially over the last few decades and is set to grow even further in line with the growing demand for resources. Secondly, whilst mining might not be the primary driver of nature loss at a global level, at a local level, a mine can have a devastating impact far greater than any other local driver. And of course, when things go wrong, when there's an accident, local impacts can be exacerbated many times over. Thirdly, impacts vary over time. So mining may not be the overall biggest driver of deforestation, but it often is the biggest driver of early deforestation. It opens the way for agriculture and other drivers to come in. And finally, and most importantly, the attempts to quantify the environmental effects of mining tend to focus on those direct impacts, the holes in the ground, the immediate impacts of tailings and pollution. The secondary impacts can influence much, much larger areas. So one study in Brazil showed mines were continuing to influence their environment over 70 kilometers from the mine site. And quantifying those secondary impacts and deciding where responsibility lies, to what extent is it the responsibility of the mine or other factors, it's incredibly hard, meaning we can't really say with certainty what the total impact of mining on nature is. So what efforts exist to make mining and nature coexist today? Mining's got an undeniable impact on nature, but one implication of being a sector with a particularly visible impact on the natural world is that miners have been under pressure to address their impacts for quite a long time, and many have responded to that pressure. So let's have a quick review of some of the efforts that are underway. The first way they can be addressed is through regulatory and legal processes. So there are two primary processes at work here. First of all, a government has to decide whether mining can occur in an area or not in the first place. Unfortunately, environmental concerns are rarely high on the agenda when these decisions are made. And one reason for this is that there's not much flexibility around where mining can occur. Obviously, mining can only occur where mining ores exist, and this is often the most significant factor driving zoning for mining. But more importantly, the environment is rarely able to compete on a level playing field. Very few environmental values are recognized economically, whereas the economic benefits of mining on tax revenue, job creation, infrastructure, and so on are widely appreciated by decision makers. So on the whole, we get well-resourced mining ministries tend to trump undervalued environmental ministries when these decisions are being made. The second process for companies wishing to proceed to the development stage will be the completion of an environmental and social impact assessment, or ESIA. Now, in theory, ESIAs identify all the impacts from a project and they set out how the company will address them. A thorough examination of the ESIA process is beyond the scope of this talk today, but suffice to say they vary hugely and many suffer from being unstandardized, unenforced, and very limited in scope. An example of this can be seen with the variation around mine closure, which is a key part of most ESIA plans, which describes the reclamation and restoration process at the end of the mining life cycle. But this requires putting aside vast sums of money from the outset and also assumes that the liability for restoration gets transferred if the company sells out before the mine closes. There are many examples of neither of these being enforced. As one weary environmental regulator told me in Africa once, most of these mines never really close. They just pass down the line of increasingly irresponsible operators. But regulations are not the only way that mines can limit their impacts on nature. Recognizing the limitations of these processes, various mining projects and companies have, to their credit, decided to go over and above the legal requirements. So one example of this is the range of companies making individual commitments to limiting their environmental impacts. So in some sectors, these commitments focus on issues such as zero deforestation or zero carbon. In the mining sector, the preference has been for commitments to no net loss or net positive impact on biodiversity. And these commitments are generally based on the mitigation hierarchy process, which allows companies to calculate, after their best efforts to avoid and minimize all their impacts, what their residual unavoidable impact is, and then they can offset this through an investment in new conservation projects. And the actual impact of these approaches is still open to debate. There's lots of debate around the methodologies, the metrics, even the morals of such approaches. Challenges also exist in the policy environment. It's really hard to implement a good offset program if you don't have clear government support. So for example, Newmont Gold in Ghana committed to an offset program as part of one of their projects, and yet every effort to establish an offset to date has been thwarted, ironically, by the imposition of new mining licenses by the government on the very sites that they were seeking to protect. Furthermore, recent analysis by the Responsible Mining Initiative highlights that there are significant gaps between the high-level corporate commitments that get all the attention and real change on the ground. Another approach for mining companies is to collaborate on a pre-competitive basis and establish general voluntary rules aimed at mitigating impacts on nature. The most robust of these are multi-stakeholder groups designed to design standards and independent third-party auditing of performance. So the Initiative for Responsible Mining and Assurance, or IRMA, have designed the most wide-ranging certification process for responsible mining in general. And similar standards focusing on the whole value chains for specific commodities have also been developed for commodities like aluminium and steel. Now, these standards play a really important role in transforming the way mining business operates, allow clear definitions of best practice to be defined, and providing the mechanisms for buyers to start to positively discriminate towards those behaving more responsibly. However, voluntary standards are most effective for pushing the front of the curve. Even the most effective standards for other commodities are rarely adopted by more than a fifth of the industry, and the mining standards represent a far smaller fraction of this. So is this enough? Such approaches are making a difference in some places. Many mining companies are clearly trying to clean up their act and reducing the impacts they're having on nature. But last year, I was involved in a project for the World Bank looking at something called forest smart mining. We were asked to identify where forest smart mining was happening, what the factors were that incentivized it. We concluded we could find no clear example of a forest smart mine. We found examples of mining projects in forests that had caused very little damage, but these are often despite the company behavior, not because of it. We also found examples of companies making really clear efforts to implement forest smart policies, and yet they sat in the middle of devastated, deforested landscapes, a clear indication that company policy alone is insufficient. The companies leading the way with individual commitments or signing up to strong standards are clearly raising the bar, but they continue to represent a minority of the industry. So I've got 3 suggestions for improvement and for discussion. At the moment, I would argue that the efforts taken by the industry to mitigate impacts far from balances the impacts the industry has on the environment. We know that many pieces of the puzzle of how to get mining to coexist with nature, but there are a few examples of where all the pieces have been put into place at the same time. So where can we improve further? The first thing is about rethinking the purpose of mining in developing countries. It used to be that mining companies could focus simply on being the best at extracting minerals from the ground as efficiently as possible. In richer countries where governance and capacity is strong, this is probably still true, but in developing countries, the balance of power can be heavily skewed. In some places, the budgets for new mining operations rival the entire regional or even national budgets of the places they're set to operate in. These are the places where the indirect impacts I described can be most significant. Mines could be established in a way that limits the direct impacts, but then cause indirect knock-on effects for which responsibility becomes increasingly unclear and nobody picks them up. In such places, there's arguably an obligation on the mining companies to rethink their purpose, thinking more like a development project than a mining project. If a project's planned in an area where government capacity is clearly not ready to play that crucial balancing role, the project needs to recognize this and take on some of that responsibility, while simultaneously supporting the development of government capacity. The second thing is about managing impacts at a landscape scale. So if companies do start accepting responsibility for managing impacts beyond the mine fence, appropriate structures need to be in place to facilitate these approaches. Managing such situations requires institutions operating at a landscape level that can match up the various costs and benefits of environmental actions, institutions that can allow individual companies to engage at a landscape level without fearing that they'll be left with a full burden of responsibility. Such a role should fall to governments, but there are a few examples of such institutions operating successfully even in the best resourced countries. Third thing I'd like to suggest is about investing in nature positive approaches. So whilst most of the focus is rightly on mining reducing its impacts on nature, there is potential for mining projects to include actions that could be beneficial to nature. Mining does not have to strive to become less bad, environmentally speaking. It could start exploring how it could do good. Nature-based solutions, as they are known, are actions that work with nature to address specific challenges. Many are focused on the challenge of climate change, but other challenges can be addressed with natural solutions too, such as water management, pollution control, biodiversity loss, even unemployment. Nature-based solutions have received mixed reception in recent years, but as the role of nature and climate is becoming increasingly recognized, nature-based solutions are gaining traction and represent an increasingly viable option for mining companies looking to go beyond doing less harm. I think I'll leave it there, and hopefully those are some ideas to kick off the discussion.
Thanks for that, Thomas. So I'd like to invite Doris and Andy and Peter and Adrian to join us, really. And just a reminder to the now 319 people that are out there, that if they want to ask questions, there's a Q&A function, so pop it into the Q&A. We obviously won't be able to deal with all the questions, but we'll try and get them answered, and we'll try to help them navigate the debate. What I'd like to do, just kick off, is maybe just to go around the table and get people to maybe respond to Thomas's provocation from their particular kind of perspective, because you do have different roles, different backgrounds here. And I think maybe start with Peter, if that's all right. You're at the sharp end, you're in the mining, you're Rio Tinto in the mining, and responsibility for that legacy, that opening and closing and planning of mines. What's your take on that? Things you'd like to bring out or things you'd like to push back on?
Sure, thanks Ian. Thanks Tom for the overview. So I think you rightly outlined a complex situation of how do we manage an industry that is fundamentally mining and removing a finite resource, and how do we balance that? The challenge I suppose I would put back is it's very dangerous for a company to take on the role of the government, as you suggest with two of your proposals. And I think what we need to really start with the premise of what are the local communities, the local society looking to achieve through the development of a resource, and working to define the outcomes that they are looking for, rather than us come with prejudged outcomes, and work with the local government, local authorities to put a structure in place to manage that. And we need to have that government structure to effectively put in place the regulations and the controls to work within. And if that has to be the more fundamental starting point, because subsequent development needs to work underneath those regulations. And if large multinational companies come in, they'll bring potentially their views and also their voluntary commitments, as you mentioned. But also if those companies don't, and we move to a smaller scale mining companies or artisanal mining, then we see a drop in potential compliance, or to a drop in what's seen as acceptable to those companies. So there's a balance to be had here, and I think the role of the state is fundamental, and also the role of ensuring that the communities are associated with the development of the associated regulations.
And can I just, before I go on, I was going to go on to Andy after this, but could that business about responsibility, those kind of three strands of responsibility, that kind of economic, environmental, and kind of social, could you say a little bit about how you see that?
So certainly, I mean, if I take it to the work around a life is finite, a life of a mine is finite. So the reality is that after 10, 20 years, the mine may close, and then we deal with a situation where the land needs to be reused and repurposed into its future. And that process really comes down to how we manage the societal expectations of that site into the future, the environmental aspirations of the community and of the commitments made, and finally the economics. And those three components need to be brought together to a consensus across the stakeholders. That is the foundation to how sites then become closed, repurposed, and become available for the next use. So that, for me, at the end of the mine life is fundamental, because these are transient activities.
And I think we'll definitely pick up that transient later with Doris. But just before that, I mean, Andy, you're at the, in terms of the technology, you're the one kind of bringing in those raw materials and raw resources. Can you say, maybe responding to how you saw Thomas's provocation and this role of kind of the due diligence around your responsibility?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as you say, we are sort of at the downstream, if you like. We are the sort of represent the part of the supply chain that is putting these materials into use. And I think we have a role to play in that regard. with how we want to develop as a society to be more sustainable. You know, the technology that's required in order to make or move us towards low carbon, to more sustainable economies and what have you, is critical. And I think it's critical because, from my perspective, certainly everyone recognises the challenge that we have, the need to be more sustainable, the need to be lower carbon. But what is often kind of glossed over is that no one wants to do that in a way that sacrifices what they have. No one wants to lose their comforts. No one wants to lose their standard of living. And so one of the key sort of enablers in being able to do that transition in that way is the technology. But obviously the overarching requirement, as I say, is the sustainability sort of context. So we have a very kind of, you know, a difficult role as it is in order to provide those capabilities in a sustainable way. But when it comes to kind of materials, you know, that is often, and particularly raw materials in the supply chain, that is where sort of a huge chunk of that environmental, social impacts occur. You know, outside of the kind of the operation and use of products and services or whatever that we may put out on the market. So we have a role to play. We have to be very cognizant of that fact, and so that we can incorporate requirements that we are trying to kind of represent and we are trying to bring into economies and societies that can be transferred across to those parts of the supply chain. I think it is very difficult for us. You know, there's some aspects where we are very close to sort of raw material suppliers. We're very close to those aspects of the supply chain. And so we can work very closely with them in terms of providing sort of additional support, providing additional guidance, you know, working with our smaller suppliers and other people in our supply chain to kind of provide a collaborative approach. But then there are instances where our visibility and sort of understanding of where materials are coming from is very distant, very removed. And that is indeed where we see sort of the biggest amount of struggle, if you like. I think, you know, I agree with sort of the concerns that raise are sort of like the role of sort of private organisations, if you like, in terms of defining what is and isn't acceptable in this context. I think there's all kinds of different cultures and behaviours and kind of standards of living that people have to take into account. So I think, you know, it's a bit of a dangerous ground, but that's not to say we can't absolutely, you know, there are sort of clear sort of ethical and moral kind of considerations and responsibility considerations that we can put in place. And I think, you know, working holistically, working across the value chain, taking our sort of capabilities, our sort of requirements that we're trying to deliver for sustainability and marrying them alongside the mines and the raw material suppliers, you know, I think that's one of the most important things, the best things that we can do as private organisations. Thank you. Thanks for that. We'll pick up some of those points, I'm sure, later on, and we certainly will go back through Thomas. But Doris, great to see the social license, the social responsibility, the relationship with the communities. That's your area. What's your perspective on this? Oh, we can't quite hear you, Doris. I know you were uncertain about the sound, so.
Can you hear me well now?
Wonderfully, thank you.
Excellent, thanks, Ian. Sorry for the. I would like to start with a question to perhaps wake up everyone. We are early in the morning here. Have you ever wondered what happens when a mine reaches the end of its life? As the colleague said, mining and other natural resources have a finite life. They can last 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, or more years, but they all end. As a mine goes to full production, there's income for the local people, and therefore the purchasing power of the local people increases. As the mine reaches the end of its life, jobs begin to disappear, and there is no more income. If investing in activities associated with mining, such as suppliers, hotels, restaurants, tourists, they will follow the same trend. They will also end when the mine ends. To continue prosperity after the mine has ended, we have to do something else. We develop, as you mentioned, a concept we call designing sustainable prosperity, DSP. The objective is to diversify away from mining. It has to have a significant impact on the economy. And It's not dependent on one commodity. So it's more resistance to the ups and downs of the general economy. It continues up to the mine is ended. The key is that mining company transitions from being the only provider of income into a catalyst for regional development. The mining company uses their position, their power to bring all the key stakeholders to the table for all to work collaboratively to build a sustainable and prosperous economy. We use the time of mining to build long-lasting businesses that will stay when the mine has ended. If successful, vibrant, long-lasting business should be the result for the regions affected by mining.
Can I ask a question about how do you recognize what Thomas talked about, that you know, the end of a mine being a succession of more and more irresponsible operators that kind of going down a kind of negative food chain there in terms of responsibility? Do you see that?
I believe there's, maybe in the past, but there's good attempts of companies to achieve some measure of economic activity after the mines have ended, but a lot more needs to be done to build long-lasting, vibrant businesses. So, and that's the reason we developed this method to help. You know, it complements with all these good efforts to focus on the specifics on how and what.
Great. Okay, thanks. I want to bring in Adrian now, because actually Vanessa in the kind of Q&A has asked, at what point can mining be a green activity? And it relates to another question where someone said, well, what is an acceptable environmental impact? You know, so bringing in your expertise from that ecological and biodiversity side, what's your take on Thomas's view?
Well, yeah, thank you, Ian. And I thought that, although I'm someone that works on the very small, I'm a biodiversity scientist that studies animals in our oceans, actually. I thought I'd go big, actually, in my initial response, and thoughts about what's been spoken about, which is actually very informative for me and our research on working in the world's largest exploration frontier for minerals in the Central Pacific. I just think for a moment, 50,000 years ago, the first human picked up a stone tool. That was probably without any environmental scoping report or environmental impact assessment or EIS, or you could be fairly certain that they just got on with it. And for the following 50,000 years, that's sort of effectively what humans have done. And we now at this astonishing moment when humanity is coming together to say, can we make these types of activities sustainable? You know, it goes not just in mining, but right across all of industry. And I think that's, you know, that's absolutely fascinating. And the sort of point, just to pick up on two things, one, you know, about the idea of communities and their involvement, and one about the role of the state. We're at this unique juncture, actually, where in one of the world's largest mining frontiers, there is no state and there are no communities. And that gives a kind of unique opportunity to rethink, I think, a little bit about how, you know, our relationship with the environment on a very fundamental level. And this goes, one of the biggest debates in the sort of marine mining concept is this idea of going into a wilderness area and changing it. And this is the fundamentals of what we're wrestling with. And it's quite different. And it cuts right to the core, but I think it can potentially inform, and we might come back a little bit to that when we come back to the debate about these sort of specific impacts in how they're rated, which is really crucial to sort of ultimately making decisions to go forward.
I thought I'd maybe throw that same point about, you know, what point does mining potentially become a green activity back to Thomas. I mean, do you think that's ever going to be the case, that you're going to have a situation where it could be seen as a green activity?
Well, that question about how much, what was the original phrasing of the question?
The other bit was about, you know, how much is an acceptable environmental impact?
So obviously there's no single answer to that, and it's got to come down to a decision made by the people that will be impacted by the effects there, and weighed up with different things. But I think the most important thing is that all of the parts of that decision are equally visible. So at the moment, the environmental implications tend to be fairly invisible in these decisions. So it's a mine is a good thing because of the jobs it creates and because of the products it's going to produce, et cetera, et cetera. And the environment sort of, it doesn't have a voice hardly in that in that discussion. So I think if it was more balanced, and if you recognize what you're sacrificing and you still decide, well, those benefits outweigh those negatives, then people it's difficult to sort of argue with whether people are making the right decision or not. But I think the key thing at the moment is that those environmental values are just so invisible and unappreciated.
There's a general question I'd like to bring in. I'll probably send it to Peter first, but it's probably several would like to come in on it. It's from John Thompson, who I think it's probably in Doris's backyard over there in Vancouver. He says, if we accept the significant role of the state, surely we must also recognize that not all states are equal, and some simply don't have the capacity to regulate effectively. How do major companies operate in this case? Peter, would you like to look at that kind of differential inequalities in the kind of governance?
No, absolutely. And I think certainly my experience, large companies have partnered with the likes of the World Bank to help build capacity in governments around the world to help ensure a level playing field for all operators in that sector within that country. So that development approach has been one where we've partnered, I think, to take that forward. Obviously keen not to be seen to be manipulating, so hence we work through partners such as the World Bank to bring that. And there are some common approaches to supporting the development of mining law around the world. So that's been an approach that's certainly been seen, and there are varying levels, and that is one of our significant challenges around the varying different approaches of different legislation, and that does have a big impact on how we can operate consistently and effectively. And then just to come back onto the informed decision making, I think Tom's last point around how do we ensure informed decision making so that we value nature as well as the upside that may come from a mine and the downsides. We need to have absolutely a better level of transparency around that. And I think that is a key piece in how we value nature and how humans perceive damage and look at what they want to preserve and conserve. And I think some tools around landscape level land use planning is kind of the tools we're seeing developing in that space, which allow those discussions to be had with all the stakeholders around the table to start to bring a common understanding and to be transparent about that and to enable then informed decision making going forward.
Does anyone else want to come in on that question? I mean, Doris, I wondered if you had some thoughts on that idea, but different states having different levels of in terms of the social responsibility side, social license.
From the government point of view, or from
you work in lots of different places in parts of the world.
Yeah.
I just wonder if you'd have thought on that.
Yeah, because it is a collaborative effort. Mining comes and goes in a glimpse of time. And as Thomas said, we have to rethink the purpose of mining and look rather as a development project. But it's not the mining company who's going to do that. And that's my point. They become the catalyst. They come for a short time. So during that time, they bring everyone to the table. So the government has a key role, of course, in providing infrastructure, all the regulations to protect the environment and so on. But it's all the stakeholders, the private sector, entrepreneurs, because my focus is, of course, sustainable economies, but even for mining, to look not just as going in and extract the value of the ore, but rather what are you going to leave behind? What's the impact of the environment and society? Would you leave it better than you found? And not just the environment, but also society. So for me, it's like truly, there's not one or the other, but together. And the mining playing a key role to be in the catalyst, bringing everyone to the table because they have the power during the mining time.
There's a really interesting question that Laura Martin's posed. She says, did the panelists think that some sort of international mining inspector / regulator could play a viable role in safety and sustainability to move away? And this may be the key bit, this constant battle between mining companies, governments, communities. And maybe just adding on to that there, if it's not an inspector or a regulator, I've heard it touted, an equivalent of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but it's for something for this equivalent for georesources, some kind of international body. I'm going to throw it, Andy, oddly, it might seem to you, but would that help corporations and companies if there was some kind of go-to international authority to look at this?
I think in some ways, yes. I I don't know if I'd go quite that far yet. As I think, definitely standards, definitely consistency. I think, where we are talking about something that is so integral to what we're trying to do as a society, just generally, but also I would say it's integral to us, as I say, transition to low carbon. I say we need all this technology that requires new materials, changes in what we're going to be using and how we're going to be using it and what have you. So if we think about that as the challenge, everyone's got to be working together, as I say. And so consistency in what is required and what is expected is a key part of delivering that effectively. I mean, we already see it to some extent, with things like conflict minerals, if you like, regulation. I mean, there was the Dodd-Frank Act in the US. We're seeing the EU kind of requirement at the start of next year. But even when it was just Dodd-Frank, and it only affected, companies that reported, on the New York Stock Exchange and what have you, it was it spread out much broader than that. So many companies, us included, we weren't directly mandated by that requirement to do anything because of where we're based, but a lot of our customers were. So, our customers are asking for it, therefore we have to ask for it, and we ask our suppliers for it, and so on and so forth. And it did provide a bit of consistency, if you like. Absolutely, there were concerns about it. Did it work? Did it really apply properly across the value chain? And a lot of those learnings were transferred across to, the consultation on the EU requirement. And I think, you could pick holes in that and sort of say it was bad because it didn't really do anything. But I genuinely think that the process we went through with that, we learned a lot and we were able to build a better system. There's always going to be opposing views and different expectations and different requirements. But I think everyone working together does find a way to start somewhere and move forward. I think, and that's what I would say here. There's definitely some things that we all agree on that need to happen, and we need to be done, and it needs to be done in a certain way. And whilst, you may have to start at sort of the lowest point where the kind of the least developed people are, it's a starting point, and you can move, you can share your knowledge, and you can move up that kind of hierarchy of capability. And if that's provided by an international body or whatever, I mean, I don't know, but definitely consistency and standards.
Yeah, I could probably jump in there if you want.
Yeah, please do.
It's very interesting to hear this, because actually, I mean, I sometimes, as a thought experiment with my students, I say, well, imagine if prior to a big new industry starting, humanity got together under to create a new legal treaty which protected the environment and only permitted a mineral extraction activity to occur after we determined it was economic, legally fair, and environmentally sustainable, but all of those things equally important. Wouldn't that be quite a remarkable thing? And actually, in the case of deep sea mining, to date, it's a scary prospect for many, but the reality is, in our high seas environments, that is the case. We have the International Treaty, or the Law of the Sea Treaty, which has protected our deep oceans from marine mineral extraction until such time that we work out that it's legally fair and economic and environmental. And so maybe that is a model to some degree, that we can learn from. This idea of actually not jumping straight in before we figure out how to do it in a fair way. And as a biodiversity scientist, I mean, I say, well, I think if you want to make an operation safe and sustainable like this, the first thing you've got to do is get the science right. If you want a COVID vaccine, what do? You get the science right. It's the same with all of these major global issues, climate change and so on. We have to get the science right. And then secondly, you have to communicate that science to all of the stakeholders. In the case of deep sea mining, there aren't really local communities that live there, but there are obviously in many of these terrestrial mines. Is that communication is key. People need to know what the impacts are and how significant they are, and then they can judge for themselves, whether that's something that's a go or a no go from the point of view of the environment. That's not a scientific decision, but it's a provision of that scientific data, which is absolutely key. And that's something that we're not doing a great job in the deep ocean world. We've clearly failed in that communication of what's happening there. So that's my 2p on that.
Just a very quick, Thomas, have you got any quick thoughts on that global governance thing? And there's been a couple of points in the chat around sanctions, which I guess is, what's the sanctions if you do going to have some kind of more stronger regulatory system? What are the sanctions that can get imposed?
Well, on that first part of the question, the first thing that springs to mind is I mentioned the sort of variability around the environmental and social impact assessments. That's an area where we could really benefit, and it'd be quite easy to do, I think, to get standardization about how they're applied, and also making them public knowledge. There's a lot of really useful information that is gathered on each of these reports, and yet they tend to sort of be hidden away and then have to be repeated by the next ones. And so just getting organized around how we do our environmental impact social assessments and how we respond to those would be a really useful international coordination job to do.
One thing that I think is geared towards you there, Thomas, actually specifically picking that up, said, you know, is there any evidence that offsets work? Isn't it clear that a governance framework does not exist in most countries for offsets to be successful? Why continue to endorse a policy that's demonstrated not to work, for example, in Ghana and Guinea, that's facilitating massive forest destruction by mining? So, you know, picking up that governance issue is not really working in practice, even as it exists now.
Yeah, to some extent, I'd agree with that. I think the only places where offsets has sort of been shown that it is working to some extent are places where there is a governance structure in place. So you can argue to some extent in the US, in Australia, and in South Africa, where there are governance structures in place, that some of these offset approaches are working. Elsewhere, if they work, it tends to be despite the lack of governance support. It's much harder to do.
Helen is provoking us here with the question. Says there's a lot of discussion about what can be done, and lots of panel members have implied it's someone else's job. My challenge to each panelist is, what is your contribution going to be? What are your organization going to take responsibility for? It wasn't directed at you, Peter, but I think in terms of the mining companies, is there a change happening around in mining companies about that sense of taking actually ownership of that responsibility from your perspective? And then I'd see Doris wants to come in. I'll let but Peter first, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a good challenge, and I think we do have to be part of the solution, and we do have to be actively moving. And it is hard and difficult. There are probably no simple solutions. So certainly in the mining sector, we see an increasing activity around international standards. So the recent work around the global tailings standards come forward in the last 2 years in response to Brumadinho and other tragic events. So there is a coming together of the sector around organizations such as ICMM, which move forward as a collective and raise the bar and try and capture good practice and communicate that. So there is work within the sector. That doesn't represent all of the miners. It represents a section who've come together to form that group. So ICMM's a start, so working together. The second is there is a societal push to broaden the view, not just on environment, but also bring in the views of the local stakeholders and communities. And I think we'll see more and more of that approach to moving and taking on. And I think we'll see increasing agreements and more formalization of prior free informed consent coming into the discussions that take place at all our mines. And that I think is a very positive step forward. So I think there's working together, there's a bringing in the social components to this. Certainly in the work I do around mine closures, it is around understanding the future vision of land and how it can be utilized in its next stage of its life. And that approach does bring in much more of a regional economic approach. And we've heard from Doris on tools to achieve that. So that would be sort of 3 points.
Thanks for that, Peter. I'll throw to Doris now about that, particularly the stakeholders, the social side. What is your contribution? There's a finger pointing here.
Yes, I would like to touch also the challenge from Thomas, green mining, and what are we going to do for it?
We're into the last 10 minutes, folks. So please do. No, on you go.
So in the future, there'll be more need for solutions for protecting the environment and climate change, as we all know. It is critical, and there is value by keeping forests, lakes, biodiversity healthy. I want to give 3 quick examples. For example, in northwestern BC, there is clean power. So we can transition from clean power into low carbon energy solutions, such as power storage, for example, and develop the know-how and technologies to sell to other parts of the world. Northern Ontario has a large mineral deposit in the wetland area. So peatlands are key for carbon sequestration. So we could envisage a mining with minimum impact to the environment, but build a business case to keep the pit bog healthy. So this area became the center of excellence for carbon capture and know-how technologies. And the last one, Peru and Chile, they have no water and they can't survive after mining, but they have the best solar potential. So they could specialize in perfecting the solar technology to desalinate seawater, dense agriculture, innovative products. So therefore, mining is a catalyst for long-lasting business that have to do with protecting the environment and climate change.
Thank you. And Andy, in terms of, you're now the representative of the whole manufacturing world, industry across the world, your responsibility then for responsible sourcing and governance.
Well, I mean, it's exactly that. I mean, you know, we are procuring things, and so we have a responsibility to ensure that we're procuring things in a responsible manner. So, you know, the processes that we already have in place and that we will continue to build upon are all around sort of certification and declarations from our supply chain. The problem we have with those is the kind of the penetration that they have. Like I say, it's very easy to kind of get tier 1. We get to tier 2 and tier 3. It's very difficult. And then even when you do get information, it's kind of an aggregated sort of batch of information. It's very difficult to pick out what is relevant to you and not. So the kind of things that I know the sectors that we operate in have started to kind of look at is kind of, it's more sort of bespoke life cycle assessment tools, if you like. So and traditional life cycle assessment tools look very much at environmental impact categories and what have you, but the ones that I've seen being developed look more at sort of where suppliers sit in terms of regions and where they operate in terms of regions, and then look at some of the kind of the standard metrics around governance and sort of how that region is operated. You know, it looks at rule of law, it looks at kind of the state of governance and what have you, and all kinds of sort of diversity measures and what have you. But the point of that being that you do your kind of your standard stuff, your compliance stuff, and you get your declarations and what have you. But if you put your supply chain through this kind of process, it should throw back at you suppliers or regions where you're operating where things may not be to the standard that you expect. And that's not to say that they don't do business with them. That's to say, go and dig deeper over there and find out what's going on over there. Where you do find problems, again, what we're seeing companies in the sectors we operate do is to collaborate in terms of funding opportunities and support activities to go into those regions, not as companies themselves, but to kind of fund professional activities in those regions to help improve kind of governance and sort of standard of living there, if you like, to kind of avoid all the kind of negative aspects of kind of poor management of mines and poor management of mining activities. So, you know, I think those are definitely steps in the right direction. I think that's certainly a lot farther than I think regulation would have us do. But I am already seeing, as I say, companies in the downstream sort of area doing these kind of things, and I think more of that, and it would be very much welcome. But definitely, it should be within our responsibility.
Thanks for that. Adrian, we've only got a few minutes left. Adrian, I'm going to ask you that same question, but from a slightly left field. The research committee, the academic committee, you said about the science. What is the responsibility of the scientific academic community in all this?
Well, I don't procure much minerals, so I can't comment too much on that. But
you work in a place that's got full of minerals.
We all need minerals unless we totally reject society. So yes, well, we do collect. We have a mineral collection, of course. But that's that's important because it's ultimately, I'm a biodiversity scientist, but our mineral collection is an equivalent collation of the diversity of minerals on the planet. And that's the point I would finish with is that biodiversity is absolutely fundamental. You want to make mining safe and sustainable. We have to find a way of doing these activities that protect biodiversity. The planet can survive, or humans can probably survive a little bit of global warming. If that's not a controversial thing, it's going to be awful and we don't want it. We cannot survive loss of biodiversity. Biodiversity totally underpins every single thing that we rely on for our existence, the food we eat, everything. So that has to be key. But biodiversity as a word is hopeless. You have to have really, really good science figuring out what that means and what protecting biodiversity actually means, what aspects, how it benefits local communities, how it benefits climate, ecosystem function. All of these things require that detailed scientific knowledge. And I just think that's absolutely critical.
Thanks for that. We're almost out of time, but Thomas, it's only fair to give you that kind of final thought about that same question, really, about what do you think the critical role of organizations like yourself, and particularly that NGO community, what is the role there?
I think the NGO community has got two roles, really. One role is on the pushing for change. It's been that watchdog. It's holding companies, governments, individuals to account and shouting about the issues. We do that a little bit. Other organizations do that better than us, I think I'd argue. The other side of the coin, though, is that that's sort of push side. The other side of the coin is you can't just complain what you can't do. You've got to start giving some options of, well, what can you do? What's better than what you are doing? We try and focus a little bit more on that side of things. So we do work in partnership with companies. We're very active on the sort of development of standards in this space and trying to provide solutions of what you should be doing rather than not just what you shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank Helen there for that question, which really kind of cut to the bone in terms of trying to get that. There's been some great questions that I've not been able to get to in the chat. Many of those will get addressed, and we'll try to address those other ways. But for now, we're out of time. It's flown by. I'd like to thank our panelists, Thomas, Andy, Doris, Peter, and Adrian for an enlightening and really engaging, entertaining conversation. So thank you all. And for the now just under 300 people that are listening, thank you for joining us.